What is up, DS3 TV? We are back for another video. This one is another Ottoman War video. We have done so many parts of the Ottoman Empire. I don't know which part this is anymore, which you will definitely see it in the title. So yeah, this is the Battle of the Mohawks, 1526, and yeah, so let's get into it. And yeah, you already know this is by Kings and Generals, and yeah, let's get into it. Also, subscribe to the channel, and subscribe to the channel when you get 1,000 subscribers by Valentine's Day. And also, I want to, also suggest videos in the comment section down below. I will get around to watching them eventually, and yeah, so let's get into it and play.
By 1522, the great Christian fortress of Rhodes had been taken, and the Ottomans had regained dominance in the Mediterranean Sea, so all their resources could now be redirected towards the mainland. Their target was the Kingdom of Hungary, a fragile land rife with internal chaos, a nation ripe for the picking. Welcome to our video on the Battle of Mohács, one of the most significant clashes in the history of Europe. This video was sponsored by Vikings War of Clans. This game was inspired by the famous strategy games of the 90s like the Command & Conquer series, and has a similar style to the games that we all loved playing growing up. It had been the ambition of the Ottomans to conquer the heartlands of Europe ever since Sultan Mehmed II. Suleiman I knew that the Kingdom of Hungary was the door that could lead them into the core of Christendom. And with the current political climate in Europe, the Hungarians would receive little to no aid against this pending Turkish invasion. Suleiman's reign began with the conquest of the Hungarian-controlled city of Belgrade in 1521. With the fall of Rhodes in 1522, he was able to refocus his resources back onto mainland Europe. Europe was a divided continent, whose great powers were locked in perpetual feuds. Among these were the Kingdom of France and the Holy Roman Empire, ruled by Charles V of the famous Habsburg dynasty. These states were too engaged in a struggle over control of Italy to pay mind to the Muslim Empire at their doorstep. This was something the Ottomans intended to exploit to their advantage. In 1525, the Habsburgs of Spain and Germany crushed a French army at Pavia and captured the French king, Francis I. Francis was forced to make territorial concessions to the Habsburgs and relinquish his claims to Italy. Out of desperation, France began looking for an ally to aid in their struggle against the Habsburgs. Francis turned to the Ottomans. He implored Suleiman for an alliance and pleaded for him to attack the Habsburgs. This sent shockwaves throughout Europe. Suleiman was delighted at the prospect
I mean, yeah, of course he was delighted. It makes sense. This is what he wanted all along, and he definitely just gets to do it with France's help, and basically permission gets to overrun one of the European powers, which is crazy.
An alliance with France increased his legitimacy as a European emperor and gave him a pretext to carry out an invasion he had planned on leading anyways. In order for the Ottomans to strike at Habsburg territory like the French wished, they would need to first go through Hungary. This new alliance gave Suleiman extra incentive to finish what he'd started in 1521. And he began rallying his army for an invasion of the Hungarian kingdom. It is here we should turn back the clock a bit to explain the state of Hungary leading up to the Ottoman invasion. Since 1490, the country had been stuck in a downward spiral. King Vladislaus II was an ineffective king who sought to placate his nobility by selling almost all his royal estates to them, but succeeded only in empowering the Hungarian magnates to take advantage of his weakness. Centralized power declined, and the standing army of Hungary was disbanded by the lords, eager to increase their own profits. Things only became worse in 1514, when a man-at-arms named György Dózsa formed a peasant crusade of 40,000 farmers, originally intended to attack the Ottomans. During harvest season, the Hungarian nobles tried to force the peasants to return to their homes, and harassed their families to coerce them to do so. All that accomplished was to incite the peasants into full-scale revolt, resulting in a war that would ravage all Hungary. The rebellion was brutally put down by the voivode of Transylvania, John Zapoya, and over 70,000 peasants would be captured and tortured in the aftermath. The young king, Louis II, ascended to the Hungarian throne in 1516, and over time realized the threat the Ottomans posed to his realm's existence. His pleas for unity fell upon deaf ears, for the peasants, lords and royal house of Hungary all had enmity for one another. The land was divided and vulnerable. On the 23rd of April, 1526, Sultan Suleiman I left Constantinople at the head of a massive army, accompanied by his most trusted vizier, Ibrahim Pasha. Varying sources put the total numbers of this force between 50,000 to 100,000. It was made up of labourers, cavalry and elite janissaries alongside 300 cannon. The Ottomans embarked upon an 80-day march up the Balkans, during which torrential rains flooded the Danube River, making maintenance of supply lines difficult. Nevertheless, through the iron discipline of the vizier Ibrahim, the Ottomans reached Belgrade. From Belgrade, Suleiman sent Ibrahim ahead to capture the fortress of Petrovaradin. Ottoman sappers detonated mines beneath the walls, and the Janissaries charged in, taking the fortress while losing only 25 men. The bulk of the Ottoman army joined the strike force and moved on. Suleiman knew that the best place for the Hungarians to make a stand was the mouth of the river Drava below the town of Osijek, and so he diverted his army towards it. The town of Iok fell on August 8th with little resistance. When Suleiman and his army arrived where the Drava met the Danube, he expected to come face to face with a huge Hungarian host, but instead was surprised to find that no enemy was there. King Louis II had mustered an army of around 25,000 men in the town of Dolna. It was made up of Hungarians, Croatians and Bohemians, with a core of men-at-arms and armoured knights. Much like Suleiman, King Louis knew the importance of the mouth of the river Drava, and ordered his deputy, Stefan Báthory, to lead a vanguard there and defend it at all costs. However, the nobles refused to submit to Báthory's command, declaring they would only follow the king himself. The vanguard plan was abandoned, and the Hungarian king instead led his quarrelling army to a field just outside a little riverside hamlet known as Mohács, where they awaited their enemy.
Ah, it's Mohács, not... Okay, so it's definitely different than what I said, but, you know, we're gonna keep going.
On August 26th, the Ottoman host reached Mohács, and the two armies came face to face. The Hungarians had set up a camp between the river Borza and Mohács proper. They stood in two lines, the first line being made up of 10,000 infantrymen divided into two wings, supplemented by divisions of mounted knights. King Louis himself led the second line, surrounded by 1,000 of his personal armoured cavalry and the troops of his noblemen. Meanwhile, the Ottomans had managed to advance themselves into a position well protected by woods and ridges and set up an encampment there. Suleiman ordered his troops into a tiered defence made up of three lines. The first two lines were made up of 30,000 Rumelian and Anatolian cavalry, supplemented by 4,000 janissaries and 150 cannons. They were led by Ibrahim Pasha. The third line was led by Sultan Suleiman himself and was made up of 15,000 Janissaries and Sipahis. They guarded the bulk of the Ottoman artillery, which was protected by a circle of wagons. Lightly armed Akinji horsemen occupied the left flank close to the Hungarian line, and a rearguard of heavy cavalry and footmen remained back in the encampment in reserve. On August 29th, fighting began. The Hungarians were the first to strike and commenced their assault at 3 in the afternoon, knowing the Muslims in Suleiman's army would be occupied with their afternoon prayer. A crescendo of Hungarian artillery fired across the battlefield. The right wing of the Hungarian first line charged the Ottomans. The Rumelian cavalry were not prepared for the assault, and
Oh, that's an overrun right there. Look at that.
the heavily armoured Hungarian footmen broke through the first 2 lines of the Ottoman defence and fought their way towards the Ottoman third line. Inspired by this initial success, the second line of Hungarian mounted knights charged into battle, joining the fierce melee at the fringes and encircling the Rumelian cavalry from the outside, pushing them back towards their camp. Meanwhile, the Hungarian left wing stabbed at the centre of the disordered Ottoman first line. The Hungarians fought bravely, breaking through to the Sultan's position, who was now in danger of being cut down. However, this success was unsustainable. As the Hungarians came within range of the Ottoman wagon fortress, a volley of guns and artillery inflicted heavy damage upon the first line. Soon after, the Janissaries formed ranks around their sultan and charged the Hungarian knights, overwhelming them with superior numbers and martial discipline. The tide had begun to turn. After 2 hours of fighting, the Ottoman reserves back at camp had finally rallied onto the battlefield and joined the Ottoman lines. Meanwhile, the Rumelian cavalry began to regroup. With Vizier Ibrahim at the head, the Ottomans launched a fierce counterattack, pushing the knights in the second line back towards their camp. From here, the Ottoman army advanced on both flanks to finish off the remaining foes. The Rumelian cavalry encircled the knights from behind, while the Janissaries and reserves overwhelmed what remained of the footmen. The Hungarians were utterly swarmed by overwhelming Ottoman numbers, surrounded in separate little pockets and massacred. The battle had ended in a great victory for Suleiman and a complete disaster for the Hungarians. When the battle seemed lost, King Louis had attempted to flee. In the chaos, his horse had thrown him into the flooded Chele brook, and his heavy armour had dragged him to a watery grave. The battle at Mohacs was an abject disaster for the Hungarian kingdom, whose government was now effectively annihilated. While sources vary, it is generally accepted that anywhere from 14,000 to 20,000 Hungarian soldiers were slaughtered in the initial battle, with thousands being taken prisoner and beheaded the next day. Suleiman could not believe he'd destroyed the entire Hungarian army so quickly. He had expected more out of a kingdom that was once a formidable and powerful foe. He kept his forces stationed at Mohacs for a few days after the battle, expecting more enemy forces to arrive. When none came, he advanced to the city of Buda, taking it with almost no resistance. While Suleiman ordered the city to be spared, sources claim that his army looted and burned it anyway. The victorious Ottoman army then withdrew back to Constantinople, carrying with them the spoils of war. After the battle, the mortified Hungarian nobles were so divided and panicked they elected 2 new kings simultaneously. One was Ferdinand I of Austria, brother of the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V. The other was John Sapoya. With the help of the Habsburgs, Ferdinand took advantage of the ensuing power vacuum and seized Hungarian territory in Bohemia and the northwestern part of Hungary proper. Meanwhile, Zapoya endeared himself to Suleiman, agreeing to vassalize under the Ottomans, who became the suzerains of his realm in Transylvania. The Battle of Mohacs marked the end of Hungarian independence, with all of its former territory now under Habsburg or Turkish dominion. For Suleiman, the victory had not created a springboard for the invasion of Europe as he had hoped, but instead formed a borderland between the Ottomans and the Holy Roman Empire that set the stage for centuries of Habsburg-Ottoman warfare. But perhaps the most significant legacy of this defining engagement is the effect it had on the national consciousness of the Hungarian people, who to this day, when faced with bad fortune, utter the words, "More was lost at Mohacs."
Huh, that's very interesting that people still say that in Hungary today.
We have recorded a podcast on the early structure and administration.
Well, that was a good video. And yeah, so subscribe to the channel. Want to get 1,000 subscribers by Valentine's Day. And yeah, so let's also comment videos that you want me to react to in the comment section down below. And yeah, so let's get in. Talk to you guys in the next video, and peace.